Rob Henderson is best known as being the originator of the term luxury beliefs, which is a concept he elaborates on in his articles, along with other pieces examining sociology, psychology, and class. His memoir Troubled is a vivid account of his childhood in foster care, as well as an analysis of the relationship between family instability and undesirable life outcomes. He has a PhD in psychology from Cambridge, but his upbringing in rural America is what I believe grants him a keen insight into the minds of the intellectual elites, seeing things that would otherwise be invisible. We discussed all this and more in the following interview. If you would like to hear more from Rob, you can find links to buy his book Troubled and to his Substack in the description of this video. Thank you for watching. I often find it difficult to read if I don't have an audiobook, but I missed deadlines to read your book. There was nothing I wanted to do more than read your book, and it was like detrimental to the rest of my life.
It's always nice to hear people say that, because I spent, the better part of 5 years, with some hiccups and things in between, but it took about 5 years from the idea to completion. And yeah, when I've heard this story from other young people too. That's nice. When it's older people who grew up before the social media smartphone era, where their attention spans are still intact, and they read the book and say nice things, that's one thing. But when a young person whose brain, I'm not saying your brain is fried, but I have friends who are 20-year-old Zoomer guys who all they do is scroll TikTok and mess around on X, and they sat down and read my book. And so to hear that, it's wow, you actually read the whole thing. It's nice to hear.
Well, I'm not that young, but my brain is fried, so
okay, yeah.
It feels weird to say that I enjoyed the book, because so much of it is quite harrowing. It's I had to keep reminding myself that these are things that really happened to someone that I know, and not just the events of a novel, some kind of Dickensian story of a lot of childhood difficulty. And
I still haven't read Dickens, because that term has been used for this book a few times from other people I like and respect and everything, and I just I need to read Dickens, because I okay, well, people are going to use this. I mean, it's an adjective. He's so Charles Dickens is such an iconic presence and author and literary figure, so I still need to read his stuff. But
it's rags to riches, really. Although I don't know about the the affluence you live in, but it certainly. It helps when reading the difficult parts of your childhood. It helps to know that something better is coming, and you're sort of just getting ready to hear that bit. So
I opened that this is the preface, but then the first chapter I opened with my graduation at Yale before going into my experiences going into foster care, and I did that kind of for that reason, because I know this is going to be hard on the reader, and I want them to know things are going to end up okay, but it's going to be a long way to get there. And so if I opened directly with, because I talked to other authors and got some feedback, they're you need to end, or you need to begin kind of near the end, so that they feel less, I don't know, it's less bleak that way.
Yeah. There are funny parts too.
Yeah,
I don't know how much of it was intentional. The part of it is just the dry delivery of these events that are quite ridiculous, or just really kind of silly, and some what seemed like quite colourful characters in your life, and also just surprising events. And I wondered if this was going to be adapted into a film, if the Daily Wire was going to buy the rights to it. Have you been approached by anyone yet?
I mean, I've had informal conversations with producers. No one at the Daily Wire. If anyone there listens, I'm open to But yeah, it hasn't officially been optioned. But I've had inquiries, and again, just sort of coffee chats about it. But I think it would be, depends on how it's approached, but it could be, it could look good on the screen, I think. It's a really, weird life that I've had, and, very tumultuous. It's when I speak with people about it, I didn't realize just how unusual the story was until I got to college, and I think I mentioned that in the book somewhere, that everyone I grew up with, this is pretty, among the people I grew up with in kind of blue-collar, working-class areas of the country, I think my story would be maybe a little bit unusual, but not wildly so. Whereas when I talk about it with people who've had more middle or upper middle class, more stable upbringings, they're just blown away. And so it was important to me to just communicate not just my story, which is what the book is about, but also the stories of my close friends that I grew up with and how their lives turned out. And that's the kind of expected like modal outcome of someone who grew up the way that I did, is like where their lives ended up in kind of menial jobs or in incarcerated, or I mean, one of my friends, it was his younger brother was shot to death. Like just those kinds of stories are not uncommon in these areas, and we could talk about more at length, but just the questions around what is it? Is it poverty? Is it culture? Is it other things? We can, there's the perennial question around nature versus nurture. Like all of those things, I think, kind of those questions hang over this book. And yeah, there were some points I wanted to make around the importance of poverty versus instability and how we think about social mobility in a very, I think, limited way in Western countries. So.
Yeah, to speak to how unusual it is, there's a lot of fights in the book, not just, it sounds like you've got into martial arts at a certain age, but also just like getting into fights with your friends or with people at your school is just a sort of refrain. It's a repeating sort of plot point where you sort of, you get into a fight with someone and then they become your friend and then they help you to fight someone else. Like just that sort of playground politics, like the warfare, is really unusual in among Cambridge educated people.
Yeah.
Like even like if it was just that, it would be like surprising and interesting to there's of course there's a lot of difficulty too, but there is a kind of
I think there are like 7 or 8 fights in the book, and I don't even write about all of them. That was the other interesting process of like deciding what to keep in and what to leave out, and like what's the story, what's not the story. But yeah, it was like at a certain point it just got ridiculous, like the number of like altercations and fist fights, and so I put like some of the more interesting ones in there. But yeah, I tried, like that was a difficult decision. Like some of the I think I lost most of them in the book because one concern I had was like I didn't want people to think this was like me patting myself on the back of like, oh, look at this guy who had this hard life and like went to Yale and Cambridge and how nice for him. Like I wanted to like be honest, and my rule of thumb often was like if a story makes me look too good, I don't put it in there. There's a story early on, and I know this is kind of a tangent, but like there's a story early on. So in one of the parts of the book, when I was in the foster homes, I nearly drowned. And then later, after I'm adopted, I'm with my younger adoptive sister, and we're at a birthday party with, it was one of her friends. We were like at her friend's house, and they had a little swimming pool or like this in-ground pool in the back. And we were all like around the birthday cake. It was one of the little girls' birthdays. And in the distance, I heard some splashing, and I could see this girl, like I could tell she was drowning because I had drowned and I knew what that looked like. And so I ran and pulled her out. And I didn't put this in the book because I'm like, it makes me look too good, and it also is unimportant to the story. I think like it's not a part of the message I'm trying to communicate. And so like there were so many things like that where I want, like, does this belong here? Does it not? And so like some of the fights, like sometimes I actually won fights. In the book, mostly I lose, but those were like those were. That was the biggest concern I had, because I've read memoirs where it's just like a guy talking about how great he is, and it's so cringe.
Yeah. Having never been in a fight myself, I mean, I would like tussle and roughhouse, but never sort of hit anyone in malice. I don't know. Is there anything you could speak to with like what is it like to win a fight or to lose a fight? Like how Jordan Peterson talks like the lobster effect, like you become like puffed up by beating someone, or you feel like deflated by losing.
It's a really nice feeling.
I mean, it feels like either way you get beaten up, right? Like you're still like bloody and kind of bruised at the end.
I think even fighting, like especially among like what kind of like blue collar working class boys, that environment, even the willingness to fight, you earn some respect, even if you lose. Just the fact that you'll throw a punch or like take a punch is like. It's way better than backing down. Like backing down, you get called all kinds of horrible names, politically incorrect names. But even losing, like when I would lose a fight, it was like not that big of a deal. It's not even that like the most humiliating actually would be like walking away, because I would see sometimes there were like boys from more kind of better parents, basically, like better upbringing, and they didn't fight. They would say like, I don't want to fight you, and everyone would mock them and humiliate them and call them all these names, and I could see that like they would turn red in the humiliation, and I just felt like that must be awful. But the kid is objectively doing the right thing, but we just created the situation where it's just sort of neglectful parents and boys who want to be tough and no real oversight, and then it just turns into this like, whatever, like a softer version of Lord of the Flies, where it's like whoever can punch who, or whoever takes a punch, or physical violence takes precedent. And yeah, I mean, losing a fight isn't that bad. I mean, it's like, let's see, like, injuries suck. Like, I punched and like, broken a knuckle or like broken one of my fingers, and like those kinds of things aren't fun. Like in the moment it's exciting, but then after, like dealing with the lingering injuries. Right? But winning is like an incredibly like it's just a really nice feeling because of like, especially for a teenage boy, the respect you receive from your friends and like the reputational, like how it lingers with you after. The like, this guy's tough, he won a fight, he's so cool, whatever, and like I don't know, it's just a really nice, I'm sure there are sort of evolutionary psychology reasons for this, the kind of respect and the accolades and the feeling of dominance, all of those things, but for a 15-year-old boy to just win a fight is, there's a reason, boys get in fights, and, they want some of that respect.
Is it like something comparable to like your birthday or Christmas morning, like the joy you would feel? Or is it a completely different flavor of triumph?
It's not like that. It's maybe more akin to like winning a sports competition or like like winning an arm wrestling match. Like it really has to be like besting someone else. This is like very classic kind of evolutionary psychology about Joyce Benenson. She's this researcher at Harvard who makes this distinction between contest versus scramble competitions, and boys like contest competitions, and girls or women like scramble is like you're sort of individualistic, like you're competing but in a more sort of covert way, where
like Scrabble?
No, not Scrabble, like Scramble, like would be Scramble.
Oh yeah, sorry, I didn't miss you. I was just thinking like board games, or you're talking like in a more sort of abstract sense of competing with other people.
Like competing but in a covert, for women, it's like a covert way. It's not like women don't like publicly and openly express joy at like being prettier or being better at something than another girl.
No, they never do that.
Whereas for boys, it is a contest where it's like it's not it's overt, it's explicit, it's like I'm better than you, haha. Look at this, and you're a loser and I'm not, and that kind of thing. And it's so whether it's a fight or an arm wrestling match or sports competition or race, right? Like little boys like to race each other, see who's faster or who can eat the most. Boys will do this, like who can eat the most cookies or whatever. Like just being, having this open competition is just, it's nice to feel like you outrank someone else.
Yeah. No, I think probably sports are the closest that we in the middle class world, your compatriots at Cambridge probably know the feeling of winning a football match or soccer, as you might call it.
Rowing. Like I rowed for my college when I was in Cambridge, but this was before the pandemic, and that's actually pretty similar. If you're faster than someone at a rowing competition,
that seems more civilized.
Yes, it's much more, but that's the feeling, besting someone else. That younger boys, I think, like it kind of, men regardless of age feel a little bit of that, but
you bottle it up more when you're older.
Also just like your body changes and like testosterone and all those things. Like I feel myself, I'm a softer person now. I just, when I was writing this book and trying to like recapture the psychology and the mentality I had from whatever, like puberty to like mid-20s, I was almost unrecognizable to myself, just how much anger and rage and hostility I felt. And I think, of course, part of it is, lingering effects of the upbringing I had, but also just generally, I think all young men can relate to that to some degree, of just like having to contain everything and the impulse control and how it gets away from you, and, like mood swings and all of those things.
I think coming from the background that you have, it's interesting to see where you end up in Yale and then at Cambridge, and then coming up with luxury beliefs as a concept, because you have this insight into, what do you call them, the elites, the sort of upper strata, the academic sort of class. You have an insight into their behavior and their ways of thinking that they themselves can't see because they've been growing up with it all their life. People who go to university usually have parents who went to university. They're sort of used to that way of being. It's like the water that you swim in, right? So it takes someone like you to enter that world, which is such a rare thing to happen, I think. And you can see so much that they would never notice. I say they, like I should say we. My parents both university graduates, and I certainly felt really uncomfortable at certain points in my political awakening. That sounds kind of cringe, but sometimes when you look into things and you come to conclusions that the rest of your family, your social group, you start to, it's really difficult to stop noticing certain things or to unlearn the things you learned, but that these are opinions and views that your social group would never find acceptable. We talked a little bit about cancel culture, but I think there's a lot more kind of social fear that's even more powerful than the fear of being fired or being cancelled on Twitter. The fear of if you lost your job, like you can just find another one, maybe. But if you lose all your friends or your family because they think that you're a bad person because of the things you've said or things you believe, that's much more painful, something that you would really fear. But the way that you described going to university and just being utterly perplexed by the things they were saying is really interesting, because these things are not self-evidently true. They only seem self-evident because they've been these university students have been raised in that environment from birth to just think this way. Can you tell me about Hamilton?
Yeah, well, so Hamilton came out the year I arrived at Yale in 2015. That was after 8 years in the Air Force. So it's funny. Sometimes people ask me, they'll read like the middling chapters of the book and say, when I read about how you were then versus now, it just seems like you're a really different person. And I am different because of aging and maturation, all those things, but also just because like 8 years in the military will change pretty much anyone, I think, especially during those like formative years. I was in from 17 to 25. So I got out of the Air Force in August 2015, started classes in September 2015. And, around this time, this musical Hamilton started to get a lot of buzz, and people were, especially like people on campus, and by this point, I slowly started to realize that, it's not just universities, but it's like this whole system, this machine, like you're keeping up with the media, with the press, with, what's the New York Times saying, what's the Atlantic saying, what's, like all of the prestige media, like it's all this sort of insular world, and people loved talking about Hamilton. And so I went online, and I remember like trying to get like the cheapest tickets, just sort of looking what it was, and it was like $400 for the least expensive tickets to see Hamilton. And I'm like, okay, well, at that point I was, basically like, I was, on the GI Bill provides like a kind of decent, like a modest stipend for living expenses, but I couldn't just frivolously spend $400 to see a musical, and so I didn't see it. And then 5 years later, in 2020, Hamilton was suddenly available. Like it had been, it was this cultural phenomenon. Suddenly it was available on Disney Plus, which you could stream for whatever it is, $9 a month or something. And suddenly, like all of these same people at elite universities, in prestige media, and all these outlets, there was this like reckoning, and some of it, I think, okay, fine, it had a little bit to do with the circumstances of 2020 and all the protests, but I think even besides that, what happened was Hamilton became too popular, it became too easily accessible, and this is sort of an established finding in the sort of sociology of fashion, the sociology of what's hip, what's cool, what's trendy, is that when something is exclusive and expensive and difficult to obtain, and it's a costly symbol of how, like, if you're a member of a certain exalted segment of society, but if it's too easily obtainable, then it loses its cachet. And that's what happened with Hamilton was, today if you talk about Hamilton and say you like it, a lot of those same people will kind of, they'll give you the side eye or question you, or, I think this is kind of problematic, and they sort of dress it up in that language, but really what they're saying is it's unfashionable, it's uncool now. It's been, 9 years later, it's not cool anymore. And, I liken it basically, to fashion, that if you, if something's on the fashion runway, and then 4 years later you can get it at whatever, your local department store, it's just going to lose a lot of its signaling power, and that's what happened with Hamilton.
But they wouldn't outrightly sort of snub people for being too poor to see Hamilton. They dressed it up as a kind of, at first it was like a woke musical. It's probably like one of the most woke musicals you could see on Broadway, right? If anybody doesn't know, it's about the American founding father, Alexander Hamilton, and he kind of had his own rags to riches story. The cast is very, historically accurate, is what we call it in my house.
Historically accurate.
Oh yeah, it's
Okay.
It's not historically accurate.
Right. So tongue in cheek.
Yeah, they've got these the Schuyler sisters of these like three feminist icons, and Hamilton marries one of them, and he has an affair with the other one. And Hamilton is a guilty pleasure for me.
Okay.
I quite like Hamilton, even though it's quite a woke musical. But
yeah, I watched it. I thought it was fine. I actually saw it here in London. I think was it 2019? So I think right before it became super uncool. So 2019. Yeah, I thought it was fine. I thought it interesting. Just like, okay, fine. It's like whatever, modernized, race swapped, whatever. But I still found it interesting. Like how much, if and how much thought went into at least the one in London. Hamilton's wife was Asian, and I'm like, with
there's three sisters and they're all different races.
And I'm like, okay, why maybe the actor who plays Hamilton likes the Asian. I don't know, why they and so yes, that's.
But then it wasn't woke enough in 2020.
Yes,
it was
exactly.
culture
changed so fast.
They don't even want to like the American founding fathers anymore. The idea of the American Revolution is now suspect because.
Yeah.
I guess the belief in America is at an all-time low.
Yeah, well, there was that, but again, I also think that when Hamilton is $400 on Broadway for the cheapest tickets, then somehow it's still an acceptable cultural iconic movement or whatever.
Yeah.
But then once the plebs can see it on Disney Plus for $9, then it's like, oh, we're moving on from that.
But they have to have a justification for that. That's the thing.
Yes. Good point. Yeah. That's
so
right.
I think that's a lot of this is not that they would even think that, but it's just you start to notice the kinds of people who like Hamilton, and it's no longer your elite friends. It's like, oh, any schmo on the street likes Hamilton now, and it just starts to make you. As an elite, start to think of it a little bit lower, and then you have to come up with justifications why you think that way. I think, well, you're the psychology PhD, so.
No, I think that's exactly right. Yeah, there's a little bit of that dissonance and that sort of, reverse justification and finding ways to explain things that are explicable and can, sort of preserve your image of yourself as a good person. And yeah, I mean, this is sort of just a very simple way, I think, of understanding how elite beliefs in general operate. This term luxury beliefs, which we may get into later, but that's just, I think, a simple example, a glimpse into how this tends to work and how, it's something that I think you mentioned before. It's the water you swim in. You don't even recognize it when it's happening, and it takes someone else to describe it. I think these kinds of books are kind of, I mean, it's interesting, right? There are books like Nickel and Dimed by Barbara Ehrenreich from a few years ago, where she's some posh journalist who works a minimum wage job for 6 months and reports on what it's like to be poor in America, and it's slum tourism basically. There was a book written by George Orwell called Down and Out in Paris and London. I mean, it's
Road to Wigan Pier as well, I think.
The Road to Wigan Pier, I think less. I think there are questions. Yeah, I think that one, it may have been later, and it wasn't quite memoir, whereas Down and Out in Paris and London was memoir. And it's just, George Orwell reporting on the working class in early 20th century England. And so those books get written, but very few books are written the other way, where someone from impoverished background starts to do this sociological observation analysis of the elite class.
Because a lot of the working class don't have the to put it crudely, the verbal IQ that you have. They don't have the academic qualifications to get published even.
Yes.
You need to reach a kind of certain level in order to get past those gatekeepers, in order to even write a book that people want to read. To construct sentences that are kind of compelling and to convey meaning properly. It's kind of an academic, intellectual way to convey information.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, I mean, there's the gatekeeper point is correct, and Yeah, I mean, there's so many filters you have to go through. Of course, like anyone can go on the internet now and write anything, but in order to write something that captures people's attention and that gets the attention of the bourgeoisie, right? You still have to get a traditional publisher and do all of the steps there. And yeah, it's very few people can reach that point, and even fewer. I mean, I cite this statistic in the book about how in the U.S., 11% of children from low-income families graduate from university. Low-income meaning in the bottom income quintile. Whereas for foster kids, it's 3%. So it's even fewer. And so, yeah, it's just and this is why, like, because when I started working on this, I'm like, were there any other memoirs written by foster kids? I think I found one or two, but they're kind of obscure. No one's heard of them. I think it's just, yeah, it's very rare to find these stories. And so, no, it was kind of fun, actually, to be one of the few who were able to do this in a sort of modern, updated way.
Yeah, I was curious about knowing you. I think I met you before I knew you were in foster care as a kid, and it surprised me because you're very well spoken. You know, you speak like a university educated person, which you are. And I wondered, like,
so articulate.
I wanted to know, like, did you always talk like that when you were a kid, or is that something that you had to intentionally teach yourself, or just picked up naturally?
I think, well, so one thing, I don't actually flat out say it in the book, but I think, you can sort of read between the lines and see that, like, a lot of kids in these environments are raised by television. And so, like, in my house and then later as a younger adult, like, the TV was just always on. And so it's almost like I heard more words from TV characters than I heard from real people. And so there was a bit of that, I think, just like, oh, that's what, like, people speak like.
You wanted to talk like Frasier?
Not quite like, but like who was I don't know. I would watch like other TV shows. I don't know. I'd watch what was popular back then, like House or ER or like any of those. Like, and those were educated in quotes, right? These were doctors, not real doctors, but that's how people spoke who were in professional environments.
Actors often come from quite a wealthy background, so even when unless they're intentionally trying to sound a bit rough, they'll probably have they have to say the lines in an articulate way that you can hear what they're saying without subtitles.
Right, yeah. And that's, right. They have to, I mean, there's that idea of hypercorrection. This is like a classic finding in sociology that middle-class people, this is in the U.S. context, middle-class people speak the most articulately. And it's, the idea here being that if you're working class or uneducated, you speak how you speak, and it's just often not as intelligible. And if you're extremely educated and affluent, you don't have to impress anyone. But it's that middle class anxiety about, like, I hope people take me seriously, and they don't think that I'm one of the poor people, and I'm clearly not one of the rich people. And so they speak extra articulately. So I think that's one part of it. The TV.
You can see that with swearing, I think.
You think so?
Like if you're among grown-ups, I think it's often interesting to see who swears first, because people they're sort of waiting. The people who are more anxious, they're kind of waiting to see, like, what is the temperature of this water? Like, am I allowed to swear here?
Okay. Right.
And then, like, the person who's just like dropping F-bombs is they're comfortable doing that.
Yeah. And then,
so you'll either get like the person who does it. They can't stop doing it because that's just their personality. And then they've got the kind of person who's just feeling the easiest because they're, they know they're among peers or people who are slightly below them, and they can be a bit more relaxed.
Speak more freely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so I think, that's a good point too. That, people, just that anxiety, right? The anxiety about who can speak and what background and whether you're going to be judged. And then, I think in the military too was another thing. Is just you learn to speak clearly, you learn to speak articulately, just because you're communicating in a kind of a dynamic environment where things are moving very quickly. So I think that also maybe had some influence. But in the book, I try to resurface some of the speech patterns and habits. My friends, like, I can remember
when you write the dialogue.
Yeah, when I wrote the dialogue, or even when I was like writing my observations from perspectives at different ages, there's a lot of swearing and a lot of kind of simple-minded vocabulary that we spoke in. And over time, I mean, it was really funny because the early chapters, I would interact. I hope my editors don't listen to this, but I would talk to them. And they would say, the early chapters, it's too simplistic. Like, we need a little, the prose should be a little bit more elevated. And I'm like, no, that's how I thought. That's how I wrote when I was a kid. And then later, by the time I arrive at Yale and Cambridge, and I'm speaking in a more mature way, the way that I speak now, they're like, can we maybe simplify some of the language and the vocabulary a bit, and like I didn't actually know what that word meant, and I'm like, so it's very
like a Flowers for Algernon kind of novel.
Yeah, it's so I thought that was interesting because the point was like to write it at different stages of my life and what I was thinking and how my friends and I spoke. Every once in a while, people can kind of spot it though. Today, like if you grow up, affluent and wealthy with educated parents, I think when people spend enough time with me, usually they can tell at some point that something's a little off.
Yeah. When you start threatening people at the bar to, should we take this outside?
No, I don't. Yeah.
And I think that should happen more often, though. I think the world we live in is a bit too sterilized. So that's one of the things I liked about your childhood, even though there was, a lot of, it wasn't always for the right reasons. And I think letting men especially be a bit more aggressive, and especially when they're with other men, isn't such a bad thing. And I think that's why the movie Fight Club is so popular. But I'm going on a tangent now. Because you have this unique perspective into foster care and this sort of family instability factor, I think a lot of people, a lot of the more middle class and wealthier people, they really do want to help the less fortunate, the children who are growing up the way you did, without a stable family or growing up in poverty. And I think one of the tragedies of sort of the system that we live under, of sort of exchanging ideas, and I think people really want to help, but only in a way that makes them feel comfortable. And that's one of the refreshing things about your book, is that you give these sort of raw, genuine observations that aren't coated in, well, the government needs to give people more money. That kind of solution that everyone's comfortable saying, like, this is just a funding problem and we need to give more money to people, and maybe that would help if it was done intelligently. But I wonder if I could get you to talk about, like, how is family stability different from poverty, and what is the kind of research around that? Go into a little bit in the book, but I think that was really interesting. I mean,
it was one of the more surprising things that I encountered when I was doing research for the factors that predict childhood outcomes. And a lot of people want to know what predicts success for kids, what predicts them going to college or going to get a good job and social mobility and those things. But I was also interested in what predicts detrimental outcomes, so substance abuse or incarceration or dropping out of school, risky and reckless behaviors, teen pregnancy, those kinds of things. And so I looked into the research in developmental psychology. I mean, I studied developmental psychology a lot when I was at Yale. I was a research assistant in a developmental psychology lab, and then by the time I got to grad school, my interests sort of developed into more sort of evolutionary and social psychology. But there's a consistent distinction that evolutionary and developmental psychologists make between childhood harshness and childhood instability. And harshness is essentially defined as growing up in a low-income family, material impoverishment. And then child instability is measured by, it's a little bit more complicated. It's an array of different questions that people will ask. It includes whether you were raised by a single parent or two parents, whether there was divorce, separation, remarriages, how many different romantic partners your primary caregiver had when you were growing up, how many different adults moved in and out of your home, how frequently you relocated as a child when you were growing up, and essentially just how much sort of day-to-day instability and disorder occurred in your childhood. And what researchers find is that the link between childhood poverty or harshness and those detrimental outcomes I'd mentioned, substance abuse, incarceration, and so on, it's either non-existent, sort of statistically insignificant, or if there is a link, it's very tenuous, and it's sort of an inconsistent connection there. Whereas the link between childhood instability and those detrimental outcomes is strong, it's reliable, it's consistent, every single study I've ever looked at, there's a significant connection there. And some researchers have, when they control for income, the link between instability and childhood outcomes remains, those unfortunate outcomes. And then other researchers will actually straight up, they'll just look at sort of rich, unstable families and poor, stable families. And they find that children who grow up in rich but unstable families have worse outcomes than kids who grew up in poor but stable homes. And so to me, this is, to go to your point, that the issue in a lot of these sort of dispossessed, poor, marginalized areas, it's not just a question of income alone. It's a question of, how are these kids raised? Do they have relationships? How are the parents taking care of them? All of these other factors. And I'm sure there are confounds. There are questions, again, about nature and nurture. But I still think that even above and beyond that, growing up in that level of instability, I think, is actually like pretty evolutionarily novel. To be in such a chaotic whirlwind of different people, different environments, that it's just naturally going to have an effect, I think, on brain development and all of those other things. And so I think this is an important point to, maybe it's possible money can help to some extent, but I also think values and role models and sort of attempting to promote stability and security for kids can also go a long way.
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult thing to do, right? Promoting instability, promoting stable households when it brings to mind that expression about you putting a fish tank in a blender, and you can't get the fish tank back. You can just you've got to push soup. There's no way to we had a very authoritarian sort of social hierarchy for a long time. There were lots of ways that was unjust in some ways, but it produced very stable families. Before the coming up with the sexual revolution,
in the 1960s.
Yeah, it was very difficult to be a single parent household. If you were a widow or a widower, that was something different. But if you're to leave your spouse, especially if you had a child, or to have a child out of wedlock, was extremely difficult socially, and that might not have always been fair. But that social pressure did produce a very stable sort of household, and I think there's a lot of media at the moment that will novels and films and TV shows that make that seem like some kind of hell, that you'd be stuck with your parents having fights because they couldn't divorce. But I do wonder, looking at your research and the statistics that you cited, whether having two parents in your house, even if they hate each other, if they, to a certain point, right, not proper abuse, but if to a certain point, maybe staying together for the kids was a good idea, and maybe if you knew you were in it together and there was no getting out, those people might have. That's not to say I know lots of kids of divorced people who are very stable, emotionally mature people. It's not just divorce, right? Yeah. But it's usually these unstable households that I think many of your friends, when your child grew up in. It starts with a child being born out of wedlock, or it starts with a divorce, and then because there's not that stable structure, that allows for other people to get introduced, or step parents, or even just what would you call it, temporary step parents who just turn up and leave. And I do think it's really difficult to. I don't think we really have a word for how unsettling that can be for children. Like, what is it that's so upsetting about having like a strange adult living in your house?
Yeah. Well, it's just a novel situation to have a completely unfamiliar adult like living in close proximity, and then for that to change frequently. I mean, this is, like, I understand, right? Like, before the sexual revolution in the 1960s, I'm sure there were women and children and vulnerable people trapped in environments where the husband or the father was not a good person, but like that's an imperfect situation. But then what we have now is also imperfect, and I think in the aggregate, one of those is probably statistically worse for kids than the other. I mean, if you read about sort of the predictors of child abuse or neglect or harm, the number one predictor of that is having an unrelated adult in the home. And so, if you have a child who's living with say a lone mother, and she has a different boyfriend coming every few weeks or every few months, that is going to statistically produce a worse outcome for that kid than if she has one husband that she's married to, and even if they don't always get along. I mean, that's something that I think I write about towards the end of the book is, outside of, overt abuse or something, even if it's just neglect, like on average is probably better for the, like in my situation, my mother was an addict, my father was, it was like an extreme situation. It was the right call for me to be put into foster care, even as horrible as that environment was. It was a choice between two horrible environments, and that's the real world, where you have two, one bad outcome and one worse one. Which one do you choose? And I think we can think about this in a sort of the aggregate level for policy about should we be promoting marriage or should we be promoting freedom of choice? And I mean, if you look at the statistics from 1960, 95% of children in the U.S. were born to two-parent families, and by 2005, it dropped to 85% for educated, affluent families, and for working-class families, it plummeted to 30%. That was 2005. It's probably worse now. I mean, it is an anomaly to walk through these communities and see children raised by married parents, especially their birth parents. And I think it does sort of produce... you may not be able to measure differences between individuals, but I think generationally you can see what's been happening. I wrote this post on my Substack recently using my adoptive family as a sort of glimpse into what working class white families look like in America. So I was adopted into this white working class family, but my late grandparents, they were born in the late 1930s. They got married. My grandfather, I think, was 21. My grandmother was 18. And this was, when did they get married? This must have been the 1950s. And my grandmother told him she would marry him if he stopped smoking, stopped drinking, and stopped gambling. And he said, okay. And they got married, which that in itself is unthinkable for that to happen today. A woman would never make that request, and a man would just laugh at her if she tried. That's just how things have gone with relationships.
A 19-year-old woman as well.
Yeah, and a 21-year-old man. It just wouldn't, Anyway, so they got married, they had 4 kids, and then they adopted my birth mother, which is another story. But anyway, so then they had a 60-year marriage, they had kids, their kids who were boomers, who were raised, my aunts and uncles, they were born in the 1950s and 60s. They got married, had kids, but then they divorced. Some of them remarried, but that's a very common boomer story of marriage, divorce, maybe remarried.
Yeah, they call it blended families. You know that one?
That was that's a big thing. And so they had kids who are my cousins, same generation, born in the 1980s, some of them in the early 90s. They have kids and they've never been married. Just a lot of single parenthood, a lot of, I don't even know if you could call them blended families. It's just I have male cousins who've slept with many women, had kids with some of them, and don't speak to any of them. And now those kids were born in the early 2000s, and they're teenagers, some of them are early 20s, and they are just very behavioral issues, aggressive piercings, unnatural hair colors, just people who clearly have some internal something going on. And they were raised by my cousins, who were not always the greatest people, having lots of partners and not talking to them, and having kids and not communicating with them does not produce great kids, right? And so, up until my grandparents' generation, that was a normal way to live. And now I think we're seeing in these communities the aftermath of sort of tearing out all of these cultural guardrails, these whatever Chesterton's fences, whatever you want to call them, that those norms were actually good for most people, especially people who didn't have much in the way of income or education or cognitive capital. Or when you're a smart person, you can sort of learn through trial and error how to make good decisions for yourself, the way that I did to some extent. But for my friends and a lot of the people I grew up with, they weren't able to do that. And then with the absence of role models and good values, it just completely went astray for them. I make this
But
point
even if they figured out that was what they wanted, it would be really difficult for them to find someone to marry them and to stay married to them.
Exactly. Yeah, it's just a lot of different factors working against them. And this is not this is going to be it took generations to get here. If this were to be mitigated in any way, it'll be a generations long project too. But one point I make about sort of the elites, the upper segment of society, who seem to be very interested in just throwing money at the problem, and it doesn't seem to be helping much. Like a lot of these social ills have gotten worse since the introduction of the welfare state in the 1960s, is that they can basically pay two forms of tax. You can pay an economic tax, you can give money to try to solve this problem, or you can pay a social tax, which would be promoting good values for people. And it's a tax in the sense that like you're promoting something and you're incurring the cost because it hurts your reputation to talk about these things. And I think the social tax, even if it hurts more in the short term, in the long run, it's probably going to be more effective than the sort of economic tax of just sort of cutting checks and giving benefits and sort of subsidizing a lot of these social issues.
Yeah, I wonder how much that can really achieve. If you take the social tax and you lose a few friends because you I don't know, the way that people the social change sort of happens is, it feels so nasty, like the way you know, if you had to say a snide comment about your friend who's a divorcee, behind her back, like that's so it's so nasty to do that to someone. That's kind of how it works, right? Like that social stigma gets built up by lots of like tutting and like, no, did you hear? Did she? It's I think you're probably right, but
I don't know if you have to do it behind someone's back. I mean, I think like
you have to say like you should not get divorced.
Like if a friend of mine asked that, I would say no.
I'm in like mum's forums, and it's not like the most common type of post, but maybe once a week there'll be someone on there who's like thinking about getting a divorce, and every time I see like comments underneath are from people who have been divorced, so they're like, you've got to do it, that you'll be, that guy sounds like he's a waster. Like these are forums where men don't post, so they can just say whatever they want about men, basically, and they are often very encouraging. So like that guy sounds like they're not abusive situations. They're just like, this guy, he plays too much video games, he's boring, I don't like his friends, he doesn't support me. Things that are like genuine grievances that would probably make you quite miserable. But then I do think about going in the comments and going like, have you thought about how this will affect your children? Like this is, but like
you would be attacked for that.
Yeah, definitely. Like, I've been attacked for less. on the mum
like
forums.
Further, like we used to be in the direction of like stigmatizing women or people who get divorced, but now we've gone to the point where now we're stigmatizing people who even question it. I mean, and I think it does matter, like that kind of input, like especially at the aggregate level. Like I'm seeing this now where in the last few months 2 different people have told me that they were in a marriage, no abuse, but just like, just kind of bored, like unhappy, maybe things are kind of, maybe it's run its course. But they have small kids, and they told me, like, I read your Substack, I read something you wrote, and now my wife and I have decided to work on our marriage. Or, and the other guy who was like, now we're gonna do couples counseling, and we're looking into, speaking to someone and seeing what we can do. And it's like, imagine so that's just like one guy with a Substack, but if every single like columnist at all the prestige media outlets, all of the pop culture we consume, women who populate these forums and men who, make songs and go on TikTok and talk to young men, and like if everyone just collectively said like, obviously if you're being abused or harassed or manipulated or something, like that's a bad situation, but if you're just bored and you're, the woman, whoever you're with is just like not as exciting as they used to be, but you have kids, maybe you rethink your decision and it's not just about you and blah blah. I think like that would actually have some non-trivial effect, like overall in the aggregate on society.
I talked to Mary Harrington, who's a kind of reformed feminist.
She's
but
great.
She really believes in this sort of family structure stuff. I don't want to put words in her mouth, but when I talked to her, she said that what you really need is very affluent, beautiful women, to like young women, like the influencer type. They need to be the ones spearheading the like social change, like the social stigmas around divorce, especially for children.
Yeah, if like, I don't know, if Taylor Swift, like, it's funny, like when I talk about this, sometimes people accuse me of shaming single mothers or women or something, and like, I don't even talk about that. Like, if anything, I'm probably harder on men in my book, like, the adoptive fathers and stuff, and like the people who were not they were just not good parents. And so It's fine. I think if we just stigmatize deadbeat dads, that's fine. Just put all the stigma on them. Whatever you want, like whatever. And so if Taylor Swift got on TV and was like, if you're a father of children and like you haven't talked to your kids, like, you know, whatever, just like start castigating them publicly on TV, that would be an incredible moment.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I wonder if there's a way to do it. You know, maybe I'm just too soft-hearted, but could you just like glorify marriage? You know, I think it's already very glorified by our culture, which is, I think, probably the only reason people still get married.
I think weddings are, but is marriage glorified?
Yeah, I mean, Mary Harrington has this project to publish more kind of real-life stories of people who stuck it out, and sort of celebrating that as, you know, look at what we've gone through, and we're still here.
That would be huge. Yeah, if like, I don't know, yeah, like 20 years, 30 years, 40 years on, like people who've sort of endured and told those stories, that would be an incredible,
Your post about your post about divorce recently in media kind of got me thinking about the way that what is exciting to see in a story, right? To see someone whose relationship breaks down and they get a better relationship. That's I think intrinsically a more interesting story. There's a more novel situation than someone who's married to someone who's suboptimal, who like irritates them, and then, you know, somehow overcoming that and like, I'm just gonna be married to you for the rest of my life. The end. You know, it's like in real life that's probably the best outcome, but for a film, I think it would be really hard to get that story to work.
Is that true? I mean, there have been plenty. I mean, like, isn't that the whole premise of like a lot of? Well, I guess rom-coms are kind of like, it's the beginning of the relationship, right? You don't see like 10 years later two people becoming comfortable with each other and maybe bored or whatever. Yeah, I guess that's right. I mean, there have been shows that have depicted marriages in a pretty decent way, I think, even with problems and infidelity. Like, I think The Sopranos actually portrayed marriage in a very realistic and honest way. But yeah, you're right. Like, you know, it's just, in some ways it's more exciting to see like someone, you know, with a different partner every episode and whatever, and just, yeah, I get it.
I think there's more promise there when you see two people. You've only just seen the start of their relationship, and you kind of imagine that they're going to be great together. But once you've seen two people who are just in a room irritating each other and asking what's for dinner, it's maybe you're right. I mean, I think I have seen a few films like that, especially targeted to an older audience, about a sort of a rekindled thing. You know, I quite like there's a kind of trope. It's not that common, but you see like a divorced couple getting back together in a film. You know, like The Parent Trap. You talked about like The Parent Trap being like weirdly on TV when you were
we rented it. Like that was like, you know, that was fated somehow. Yeah, those are interesting movies. I mean, so the Substack post I wrote about like that people seem to like actually conventional stories, feel good stories, and that elites like shows that that depict family drama, conflict, sex, substance abuse. I mean, I get it. Maybe it's titillating or interesting or something, but just like glorifying it and I mean, I think there is like this weird absence of especially drama. I think like sitcoms, you can still portray happy families, but there's like an absence of drama with like happy, stable families where people are in love with each other, and you can still like, there are other ways to portray conflict besides romantic or sexual, but like that is something.
You might something like A Quiet Place. Have you seen that film? Like, it's a horror film, weirdly depicting like a happy family. It's just that they happen to be in a like post-apocalyptic situation where all of the conflict is coming from this external like
monster
that's chasing them, but they work together, and that's there's conflict, but they're all on the same side of that conflict. That's probably the better form of story, but there's always going to be an appetite for I think social drama in media.
Yes, I think The Office was good at this. Women love The Office.
Yeah, that's true.
And I think the Jim Pam story. I mean, again, it's a sitcom.
But Pam dumps her fiance for him. Like, what if she was married and she was like in love with her colleague?
That is true. Well, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, but
was he really that bad? Just because he had Roy. Is he that bad?
I don't know. Yeah, okay, that's right. I always forget about Roy. Maybe the show wants me to forget him.
Other than throwing more money at the problem of childhood instability and poverty and domestic abuse, there's a dark part of me that sees, maybe I'm just projecting, but I see something dark in the kinds of people who promote abortion, that the woman's right to choose, and even though that's nominally for all women of all social classes, I think I detect. I've had arguments with people who are pro-abortion. Not that I'm. Whatever. Let's not go into my opinions here.
I thought it was called pro-choice.
Yeah, oh yes,
Pro-choice.
So I get into these discussions, and I have sometimes heard people and women saying that if women in poverty, women in sort of unstable situations have access to abortion, then it would be better for their unborn children to have never lived at all than to live a childhood similar to what you went through or worse. And I don't think there's anyone watching this who would rather you didn't exist, because obviously you've come through a lot and you're here, and we like listening to you, but there's still this, before they're born, there's this chance to just click your fingers and it'll never be. I wondered if that's something you've come across or that you think about.
So I have I don't know if it's like a quasi-contrarian take on this, which is that, okay, so imagine you travel back to 1945 and you tell people, whatever, Westerners, hey, in like 15 years, decades into the future, there's going to be like all of this contraceptive technology, pills, and IEDs or whatever, IUD, and widespread abortion will be more or less available. I know with the recent overturning of Roe v. Wade, but generally it's going to be way more available than in 1945. Then you ask these people, so you're going to have abortion, you're going to have birth control, and so on. Do you think that in the future there are going to be more children born out of wedlock or fewer? Do you think there are going to be more kids in foster care and orphanages or fewer? Do you think there are going to be more, unstable homes and families and children who are having difficulties in their lives or fewer? And I think, most people would say like, oh, we've basically solved the issue. We're never going to have an out of wedlock birth again. We're never going to have a kid with, why would there be foster care? But instead what I think happened is that the introduction of these things actually in some ways aggravated this issue. There was a very famous paper from Brookings, I can't remember the year, it was like 25 years ago when it came out. Basically, they found that the introduction of reproductive technology, birth control and so on, reduced shotgun marriages. So basically in the past, when a man got a woman pregnant, there was all of this social pressure and stigma for him to marry her, and he felt like a personal duty to take care of her. And once the introduction of the birth control pill and abortion became available, the man no longer had any obligation. And so he would basically say, before the pill, it's like, oh, I have to take care of you. And then after the pill, it's like, no one's forcing you to have this kid. This is your problem. I'm out.
Yeah, you basically did.
Yeah, this is your fault, not mine. I didn't do anything.
Yeah, like why didn't you take the pill that morning?
Exactly. And then communities responded as well, where pre-pill communities would be like, you better marry that woman and take care of her and blah blah blah. And then afterwards, it's like, well, she kind of, it's kind of her, it's her body, her choice, her responsibility. And so I think actually in the aggregate, this caused more kids to be born. And part of this is because people in lower income communities tend to, on average, be more impulsive and have less foresight and so on. And so I think a lot of people will have sex with the intention that if anything happens, that they can find a way to terminate the pregnancy, and then they don't for a variety of reasons, and then this kid gets born into these unpromising circumstances, whereas without this technology, people were much more careful about who they had sex with and how frivolously they behaved around sex.
Or even like how much you police your own children and their behavior.
Yes.
It was a community effort to stop these pregnancies happening.
Yes, yeah. And so I actually think so then your question about, okay, well, is it better for these kids to not be born? Should they have the option available to them? I don't know, but I know that in the real world, in reality, that didn't happen, right? Like, poor people today have more access to birth control and abortion than ever before. And are we seeing, kids not be born, or, these communities have fewer kids who are born into squalor and poverty? I'm not seeing that. And in fact, I think a lot of this backfired. So that's kind of my take on the issue.
Well, that's very diplomatic. It's skirting the issue with a.
Well, I mean, what
No, I mean it's a good answer. Like
Yeah.
without having to without having to take a moral stance on abortion, you just say, well, it's not effective anyway. So.
I mean, well, I don't
No,
know.
you're correct.
I'm kind of agnostic on the abortion thing. Like, I go back and forth on that. Like, I understand both. Like, it's not. I think it's like Jordan Peterson has this great line about abortion where it's like, regardless of how you feel about it, you wouldn't want your sister to get one, right? Like, we can talk about how great it is and shout your abortion and whatever, but like, if you have a close family member or loved one, that's not something you would want them to go through. And I have a sister, and I wouldn't want her to go through that. So.
Yeah. So going away from Troubled, buy it now. Or pre-order it now. I don't know when this is going to go up.
Get the audio version.
We've already touched on luxury beliefs in this conversation, but as you're the originator, and I've been bandying this about a lot since I first read you talking about it, so thank you. I wondered if you could expand on how you think this is distinct from virtue signaling, which is a sort of the latest. Before luxury beliefs, I think that was kind of the term that we had for something similar. But I think it is different. So I wondered if it's something you've thought about. Like, is it different? Is it the same?
I mean, I guess is it? It's not the same. I mean, okay, so luxury beliefs, ideas and opinions that confer status on the affluent while often inflicting costs on the lower classes, the less fortunate. I think virtue signaling is it's either a conscious or an unconscious attempt to like exhibit your moral character. And so I think maybe there's a bit of overlap there. A lot of luxury beliefs are, to some extent, about exhibiting moral character, but that's not the main outcome. The main outcome is about status. And so there are, I think, luxury beliefs that have nothing to do with virtue signaling. So one that does, arguably, is like the defund the police movement, which is a luxury belief. But I guess you could say, like, oh, if you say defund, you're kind of, sort of signaling your virtue because you love criminals or something. So maybe. But then with something like, so for something like the promotion of addictive technology, and so profiting from it, this is an example I give in the book. A lot of tech entrepreneurs and tech executives will profit from selling addictive technologies, tablets and iPhones and so on, and they'll earn a lot of money from this, and it'll win them accolades from their peers and so on for selling this. But then when you look at their private lives, they are often very sort of austere about their own technology use. They enroll their kids in these like Montessori schools where it's pencil and paper, very old school, no screens allowed. But publicly, they're like, look at this new thing that I'm building, and you should get it. And look, and there was this famous study actually. It wasn't a study. This was just an event in the LA County foster system about a decade ago, where they bought a bunch of iPads and gave them to these low-income schools in LA. And the idea was, these iPads, and this was how it was sold. Like, when Steve Jobs and all of these people started selling iPads, this is going to transform learning outcomes for kids because you're going to have access to all this stuff and you're going to be able to learn math and read. And that's what these educators, supposedly, that was the plan. And instead, it actually diminished learning outcomes. It made things worse because these kids, of course, they're not going to use these iPads to learn how to read and write. They use them to play whatever, Angry Birds or whatever kids were playing in 2013. And so the technology just sort of, it backfired, right? So anyway, that's a luxury belief too. It has nothing to do with virtue signaling. And there are other examples, but that's the main point, is that it's about sort of elevating yourself, your status, your position. Sometimes it has something to do with wealth, but it really is about recognition, admiration from your peers, more so than being applauded for being an ethical person in some way.
I wonder if you're as obsessed with status seeking as I am. It was only something that I started to notice around the time that I started reading about luxury beliefs. I think I didn't just start to notice it with people in their political opinions, but I saw it everywhere. I always knew that some people cared about it, but I only started to realize that it's something everyone cares about, and it's I think it touches every facet of our lives. Now that we are no longer sort of running away from predators or not engaged in tribal warfare, I think so much of our attention is just on climbing the social ladder.
I think that's
Is that something you've noticed?
Yes, yeah, of course. Much more so. This is a really funny thing, and I cite this. There were two different studies that I mentioned in the book, but one in 2020, one in 2021. So this is a replicated finding in social psychology, which basically found that the people who are the highest in wealth and status are the people who desire wealth and status the most. And so, these researchers, they basically collected these objective measures of status, how educated you are, how much money you earn, your occupational prestige, things that can be actually measured. And then they administered these surveys, these questionnaires to people. And the people who were at or near the top of education and income and so on were the most likely to agree with statements like, it would please me to be in a position of power over other people. I enjoy having influence over others. Like, I enjoy when I walk into a room and people pay attention to me. Like, all those kinds of things. And so, to me, it tracks perfectly with my own experience where I grew up and in the military, and it was like, yeah, people cared about reputation and respect and those kinds of being looked upon as, admired or whatever. But by the time I got to Yale, like, the status anxiety was so intense, and reading those studies helped to illuminate for me, like, these are people who are on their way to the top 1%. And of course, these are like the status-seeking people. And so, and it's also like there's different scales: need for status, desire for power. It all falls along our normal distribution. And the people who attend elite universities and occupy influential positions in society, they're in that kind of right tail. The people who are very interested in, the way that they look and the way that they appear to other people, their reputations, how much regard others have for them. So I think it's a fascinating topic, but I only became interested in this after I arrived at a place where it seems like it's pervasive. And I think, you see it on social media too, that, there's some interesting research on the people who are heavy social media users tend to be very interested in status. And, it's like, it's a game, right? Like, it's just something that's, once you understand what it is and what people are doing, it just, I think, helps to illuminate so much of social life.
Mm. Do you think that I think we talked before about how it's the middle class, like it's the people who are reaching for the highest status, who aren't quite there yet, who are the most anxious about, and they feel insecure because they're trying to fit in with the 1%, but they're only the 5%. So they're the ones who are focused on it the most.
That sounds right to me, just anecdotally. Like, when I hang out with, like, in the U.S. context, if I'm hanging out with people who are, whatever, like, they're doing well and they got the job they want and everything, like, there's still a bit of that anxiety despite having seemingly made it. But when I talk to people who are, like, extremely successful, to where it's like, it's not a question, right? Like, they are secure, they're well regarded, they're doing they just seem like calmer and less consumed by their ambitions. Yeah, I think I understand it though. Like, status seeking is not inherently a bad thing either. Like, even when you track it across the lifespan, people are most preoccupied with status in their late teens and their early 20s, and that also happens to coincide with, like, mate seeking and wanting to build alliances and friendships and make your way in the world. And and then naturally, most people, when they reach their 30s, like, maybe they've attained a bit of success and they maybe have a family and they have kids, and, like, all of those things kind of settle in their minds. Like, I can notice that in myself. I think, yeah, just how much you care about other people and what they think of you just tends to diminish with time as you become older and more successful. And yeah,
I think you do talk about this a bit in the book, about how the people you're hanging out with are a bit rough, and the way you get status is to to swear the most or to get into the most fights if you win. And I wondered about these troubled youths who you always hear about, who I haven't got any direct experience with, but I try to imagine what it's like to be a young man with not many opportunities in education or job opportunities, where maybe if I really got my nose to the grindstone, I could get a job in a warehouse or behind a cash register. I could get like a really low level like entry job, and all my friends would think that was so lame. When it's actually you've got this ladder available of crime or just misbehavior. You and your friends got into a lot of trouble, like, for seemingly no reason, like you did things that were chaotic and damaging that benefited you not at all materially, right?
Yeah.
Not stealing, just smashing stuff, or just
vandalizing.
or just being
Arson.
impolite to adults.
Yeah.
Being the class clown even. It's like, I don't care about what this stupid lesson's about and this stupid teacher. I'm above it all, and I just by turning my nose up at it and making a stupid joke and making everyone laugh, I always put myself on like a level above the teacher. I think it must be really difficult to really try to do well in your lessons if that's not going to get you any accolades with your friends. And actually, if you're a really, if you can be a drug dealer and start bringing in money, that would, if you buy a car or you can, I don't know what else, that's probably a much easier way to be respected by your peers. Or even if you just like practice the same video game for hours and hours a day, and if you're going about that kind of neat life where you're not impressing your parents or anyone in your real life, but there's like a few people who you really care about who really care about this thing, and you've got the world record of the fastest Mario 64 120-star run or something.
That's interesting. I mean, I think there's something like, there used to be a lot of respect conferred to like young guys who would work hard. Like there was like it was dignified to like work and get it, even if it was menial, right? Like you could earn money to take care of your family or send money to your parents or something, like my grandpa's generation. And like even to some extent when I was a kid, like, I mean, I would work like odd jobs, and like I worked in high school, and I mean that's actually one thing I think that I was fortunate to experience, is at least in like the blue collar town that I grew up in, it was considered actually cool to get a job. Like it was still like, I think now some places, I don't know if it's still true in Red Bluff where I grew up, but like I do get this feeling like more and more that young people are turning away from work or thinking that it's unimportant or frivolous or stupid. But at least when I was growing up in the mid-2000s, it was like, oh, you got a job, cool. Like you're making your own money, and like there was a status there actually for young guys. So I remember this, and that was. Yeah, I mean, that was definitely one reason that I wanted to make money and get a job. And I think, like, this is why I think it's perilous to, like, denigrate the value of work or tell young people it's unimportant, because, if a teenage boy, like, I was a busboy and a dishwasher, I later got a job as a bag boy at a grocery store. Like, if I wasn't spending whatever it was, 20 hours a week working part-time jobs, like that 20 hours a week was going to be spent doing something, and probably nothing productive or valuable for society, probably detrimental. And so even if it is objectively true that working is dumb or whatever, which I don't think it is, like, turning, like, stripping people of that option or making people think that it's unworthy or something, it will lead to downstream negative consequences, I think.
I wondered about like what is the luxury beliefs. It's like a treadmill, right? Like when Hamilton becomes too widely known about and people start liking Hamilton, you have to come up with a new thing that only the elites like, that only the truly affluent, truly enlightened people know about, and you just get on this treadmill of new things or new beliefs. And I wondered like what are we going towards? Are we just going to get increasingly woke? Or is it going to sort of turn left into like some other way to be, to have luxury beliefs?
I mean, people ask that, right? Like, have we reached peak woke? Are we in a vibe shift? Or I don't know. I mean, probably, and like it's not, it probably depends on the career. Like, I think in academia, it's like as bad or worse than ever. Like, I'm still hearing stories from friends of mine who. People getting fired or soft canceled, or it's even more insidious than that, where now they're just not hiring people who could potentially pose any challenge to the ideology of the day. And so, like they sort of successfully purged like anyone who isn't a hardcore progressive. And so now the game is like just very, who's going to sign the DEI statement or the pledge to whatever. And so now it's like, the wokeness is just there, and it's not going away, I think, in academia. But like you can make a living now through Substack or alternate forms of media, and you can say what you want. I think like Twitter or X now, right? Like that's definitely not what it was 3 or 4 years ago. You are free, your wokeness has sort of subsided, but I mean, I don't think it's ever going to go away. Like, we call it woke now, but like political correctness or whatever you want to call it, like that is, people will always attempt to police each other's language and to undercut their rivals. And there's this theory that the name of it is escaping me, from Emil Durkheim, where he basically had this idea that like the amount of morality in a community will always stay constant, and that basically even if you said like all laws are abolished and there are no more transgressions, people will start to fabricate them just so that they can start to accuse one another of wrongdoing. And essentially my read of it was like to use it as a sort of a social weapon to undercut your adversaries or elevate yourself in some way. And in a weird way, we kind of did that in our culture, where we used to have this very conventional kind of morality, your grandparents' morality of like, don't steal and don't lie and all of those kind of cliched things that we think are unimportant, but they are important to have a stable society. Those kind of fell by the wayside to a large extent, and then there was this period in like the 90s of, moral relativism and, it's all subjective, whatever, and like, whatever, you do you, everything is fine. And then by the mid-2010s, people were actually unsatisfied with that state of things, where you could no longer tell anybody that what they were doing was wrong, you can't condemn anyone, and then this new form of political correctness arose, and people got very excited that finally we can say people are doing wrong things again. Yes, we can use this to our advantage. So I think now we kind of got sick of it, we kind of burned ourselves out, but it's not going to go away. It'll come back. Like, people, like today, what you post on X will be used against you in 7 years. Like, I just think that's going to happen. Like, yeah.
You're giving me an idea.
Mm-hmm.
What if, instead of trying to fight wokeness, we should try to, those of us who have some modicum of influence, try to get everyone really excited about a really pointless social cause, like eating clean. People can really moralize about food. We should just really try to get everyone to be vegan, and hope that we can moralize about that enough that there's no social energy left to spend on things that can really hurt us, like renewable energy and
defunding the police.
Defunding the police, yeah. It's like this stuff that's like actively damaging our social fabric, when really we could just all be vegans. And shaming people for eating meat. Not that I love eating meat. I just want like the least bad moralizing that I can think of is like.
There was a time actually where I thought climate change might be that thing, but now people are like literally
COVID.
saying,
COVID.
Yeah, there was a period where like, oh, good, here's a thing that like we can
wear your mask.
Yeah, wear your mask and
stop going outside.
Get your fake card or get your real one, whatever you want, and just. Yeah, I think that would be, I don't know, I don't think you can, it would be very difficult, I think, to fabricate from thin air a moral movement unless you truly believe in it and get people to invest in the cause.
Yeah, well, we could come up with something we actually believe in, then, have to workshop this at a later date. I wondered if there are any luxury beliefs. I mean, the definition of luxury belief requires you to hurt the lower classes and to not hurt the upper classes, but it does strike me that there are some beliefs, some really popular things people say that actually seem to disproportionately hurt the upper classes. It's almost like they're I think I called it self-flagellating beliefs.
Okay.
The way that people really care about recycling, or not just recycling your glass, but also washing out the glass, your glass mayonnaise jar, before, really going above and beyond to make your life difficult for the sake of the planet. Using you see like beeswax wraps. Instead of cling film, you can reuse these beeswax things that go over. They're really expensive, or like reusable nappies. Like what do they call them? Cloth nappies.
Yeah.
Like, I can't imagine anything more, like, if you really wanted to make parenting difficult, just go for cloth diapers, as you call them in your country. But, like, things that are actually really difficult to force yourself to believe that like the lower classes just apparently don't care about at all.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's funny, like, my adoptive mom, she was telling me that they used cloth diapers when she was growing up And
Okay.
like,
Maybe
'cause
I've got
I think it used to. Well, I think like it used to be more associated with poor people who couldn't afford diapers, but now it's become like this sort of almost counter signal where now you're doing it for the planet, and actually poor people would probably prefer, or anyone would probably prefer disposable diapers, right? And so. I mean, I don't know. There's luxury. Like, how does this? I mean, I think it's more just a sort of a costly signaling of like your demonstration to the cause and how you can afford. Like, yeah, you can afford to do these things. You have money, right? Like, if you take a picture of yourself on Instagram using the beeswax thing, like you're very clearly, covertly or overtly signaling, like I'm not a pleb using cling film, and I'm rich enough to afford this, and so it's there are a lot of layers to that, and I think it's fine. Like, I'd rather them focus on buying expensive kitchen stuff than telling the rest of us what to do. Yeah.
Maybe those cloth nappy mums are just flexing, and they're secretly using disposables.
Mm-hmm. Well, if and when I ever reach that level where I'm rich enough to do the cloth nappies, the cloth diapers.
If you could, have a wife who doesn't have a job, that would help.
Well, here's like so my adopted mom, she was telling me about this, where like apparently because you have to use this like giant clothespin thing to like close it, and she said that often like the material of the fabric and the safety pin itself, like it doesn't always go through, and so if you want to, essentially you have to like make it like lubricated. You rub it on your head and take the hair oil, and then you push it through. And I was like, that sounds like something from like the Middle Ages, that's like, or like the Great Depression or something. And like my mom was like doing this on like the 80s, like okay,
Yeah, I mean the sort of classic cartoon of a baby often contains like a cloth nappy with like a safety pin in it. But it does seem like it's something from a bygone era. Yeah. Almost like a.
And it is like so few people do it now that I can understand why rich people would be interested in that. And yeah, like you said, like you have to have a mom who stays at home and like whatever. Yeah.
Or your own nanny.
Oh yeah, or a nanny. Either way, like someone like you're very financially secure if you're able to do that.
True. Yeah, that's a good point. That's just plain old costly signaling. Then that's I think conspicuous consumption. I wondered if there was, in a similar vein, if there's like an Uber flex of, how Mark Zuckerberg will just wear like a grey t-shirt and jeans for like press conferences, or even if that t-shirt and jeans are very expensive, he's not trying to impress you. That's the area he's trying to give off. Like, I wondered if I don't know because I don't associate with these sorts of elites, but I wondered if there's a luxury beliefs equivalent where at a certain level you can just say, global warming is a hoax. The moon landing.
You're so above it that you don't have to impress people.
The moon landing is fake. You just you can just say something ridiculous, and everyone in the room is like, he must have a really high. He must have a really high status.
Really rich.
I can't believe he said that.
I mean, well, I guess like some would argue that like Elon Musk does some version of that. Like he doesn't go as far as the moon landing, but he'll say things or he'll express views that like they just like horrify the media class and like other sort of upper middle people who are doing well, but like clearly aren't in that like stratospheric level of wealth and fame the way that he is. So yeah, I mean that's the example of Zuckerberg and the flip flops and the hoodie and everything like. Yeah, they're playing a different status game, right? Like the whole thing, right? Like where Zuckerberg's playing his he's playing a success game to like make Facebook or Meta super successful, and but like even Zuckerberg himself, I'm sure he has to depending on the time of year and the political climate, pledge fealty to luxury beliefs in some way. Like the luxury beliefs is just like sort of all encompassing for everyone, where you have to say something about it. Like I don't think we're going to see Zuckerberg saying we should fund the police or promote monogamous marriage or whatever. It's just different kinds of status games. Like if you go to, this is like a cliche almost, but it does reflect reality. Where if you go to certain universities and like certain like full professors or professors with endowed chairs, they have their own parking spots. And the one I think there are some where they actually have reserved parking spaces for Nobel Prize winners. And almost always those cars are in like very bad shape. They're like old, beat up, but that's like there's like a sign that says like reserved for Nobel winners or Nobel laureates, and it's like I won a Nobel Prize. Who cares if I drive a beat up 25-year-old car?
Right, yeah.
It's almost a counter signal.
No, good point. Yeah, I think I do respect someone with a beaten up car a little bit, actually, secretly. And speaking of opinions that Mark Zuckerberg would never have, now that we're at the end, I feel like I can ask you the really edgy question that I've that's been on my mind.
If they've been watching this long, then
yeah, that is actually the principle that I live by with my podcast.
Got it.
I don't know if
Best
it's working.
for
It's like a superstition for me. Like, I believe that the censors won't watch an hour and a half of me talking to Robbins.
Right. Yeah. So now, let's get me cancelled.
So, I really believe in family stability. Like, it's basically all I do these days. Like, since I got married and had kids, I'm just, like, all about that. Like, I think that kids should be raised by two parents if that's at all workable, even if the parents are miserable.
Yeah.
I'm not miserable. I'm really happy being married. But I do wonder if the conservatives aren't a little bit too eager to pick up this narrative of the family structure and fatherlessness and these buzzwords that make it sound like you really care about the underprivileged people and, you know, keeping them out of prison and making sure they turn out to be really good citizens. And that's a really good cause. But it's possibly the biggest taboo is, you know, even among conservatives, is to suggest that there might be something genetic in this correlation. You know, bad fathers, bad mothers, especially fathers who just will abandon their children and don't want to have anything to do with parenting, or they just can't financially support their children. That they have sort of antisocial genes. That sounds very eugenics-like, but that's probably the blunt way of putting it. I think, though, I would be surprised. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a geneticist, but it seems like there would be some behavioral bad habits that could be passed on this way, and that even if we go back to, you know, 50s utopia or even like Middle Ages morality of not having children out of wedlock and staying married, that even so we wouldn't necessarily be able to rule out. Well, I don't know. I mean, in those situations, you probably wouldn't have women sleeping with these men, and they would be out of the gene pool because no. Yeah. Anyway, I think in the interest of really pursuing truth and not ignoring something because it's uncomfortable, I wondered if that's something that you have thought about with this sort of family stability index and looking at outcomes for these kids who are raised in this way.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm familiar with these arguments and have a decent amount of I've read like a lot of the behavioral genetics research, Robert Plomin's work and Eric Turkheimer, and like there's a lot of interesting work out there. So I guess there are two things I could say about this. First is that, at least from my perspective, like in this book, when I defend the importance of family stability, like I have a line in this book somewhere where even if it has no effect on a kid's future whatsoever, it's still, it's a good in itself for a kid to have like a safe, secure, loving attachment to their parents. Like, so if there's an infant born and I can predict with my behavioral genetics model with 100% certainty that this kid is going to grow up to be a troublemaker or work a menial job or be a criminal or what, like basically live like a less than promising life, is it still important for this kid to have a decent childhood and to have a mother and a father who loves him and raises him and takes care of him, knowing in advance, like with our crystal ball technology, that he's not going to be the greatest, most, like live a productive, law-abiding life? And I personally, I think the answer is yes, regardless of how the kid turns out. And then on the other hand, like this is the other sort of implication of the behavioral genetics stuff when people get too heavy into it, is like if I tell you that this kid is going to grow up to be a super successful billionaire Nobel Prize winner, regardless of how you raise him, does that give us license to treat him however we want now? Because, hey, his future is secure. He's going to be a billionaire Nobel Prize winner. Even with that knowledge in mind, I still think it's important for us to treat the kid with respect and kindness and love and care and warmth. And that you shouldn't just neglect him because you know he's going to be successful anyway. So all of that being said, I think like people, this is like a post that I should write at some point. maybe POAST, but like a post, where, look, I understand the behavioral genetics research, but almost all of it was conducted in a period where basically, so there's like a range restriction issue. I don't want to get like too heavy into the statistics, but basically what happened is when behavioral geneticists collect these data, these are kids, so like twin and adoption studies, for example, where one twin is adopted into one family, the other twin is adopted into another family, and then these researchers do these longitudinal studies where they track them over time and say like, hey, when these kids are adults, their personalities are the same, their intelligence is the same, roughly, and on and on. But the issue here is that, like with these twin studies, these kids are basically adopted by middle-class families, and the family environments that they grew up in are basically the same. Like if one kid is raised and the mom is a doctor and her dad is a lawyer, and the other kid is raised and the mom is an accountant and the dad is a veterinarian, and they live in a middle class, like low crime area, and they turn out to be they have the same genetics and the family is basically the same.
Yeah.
Okay, and so there have never been, to my knowledge, any studies where you take one twin and put them in like a low-income area in the projects of the Bronx, or even just where I grew up in Red Bluff, California, and then you put the other kid with whatever, like a upper middle class, family in the Upper East Side or something, and send them to private schools, and then sort of track them over time. I think you would have very different outcomes for those kids. And so I also use the story of my adoptive family to illustrate the importance of sort of culture and milieu and generational changes over time that, like up until my grandparents' generation, everyone was married and they got, whatever, stable family, and then each generation became more and more unraveled. I don't think you have to be like a clinically diagnosed antisocial psychopath to abandon your kids. I think this doesn't reflect very well on men in general, but I think like the average guy, if there's no penalty for leaving your kids, and there's no social pressure, no shame or guilt or stigma or what have you, I think like the median guy would be like on the fence, let's say, if there's literally no penalty. Yeah. And there's kind of a reward in that, like, you can go have sex and hang out with other people now. You're off the hook. Like, I have no doubt, like, 1 to 5% of men, regardless of society and structure and culture and norms and all those things, like, let's just say 5% of guys will always be horrible. I think, like, 30 to 50% of guys are kind of responsive to incentives and social stigma and those kinds of things. And I think that's why we see this sharp rise in fathers not sticking around for their kids over time. Like, in 1960, a lot of those guys would have stayed and, done the right thing. And now we're in a culture where you can't judge or shame or stigmatize it, and so guys are just kind of doing what feels like. I don't think, like, it's literally 40% of men in the U.S. I think it's similar in the UK and in Western Europe. Like, this is the other thing, is like, people talk about like ethnic differences and fatherlessness. Like, fatherlessness in the UK is mirrors almost exactly the U.S., despite it being like an overwhelmingly white country. And so I don't think, like, whatever it is, 40 to 50% of men, these children who are born in these fatherless, I don't think 50% of men are psychopaths. I think like 50% of men are just men.
Respond to incentives.
And they're just sort of doing what they can get away with.
Yeah. No, I think parenting, it's really difficult, and I'm not really surprised when people don't want to do it.
Yeah.
Once you're kind of in there and you have a bond, you kind of start to enjoy it. But when it's like a theoretical thing, like, oh, there's a child somewhere, I think it's just not very much fun. As a prospect, when especially if you've got other options. I do wonder about in ages gone by, when divorce was very uncommon, but being widowed was certainly not very uncommon, or having like a father in the Navy, or in a sailor, or in the military, where you similarly might have a father absent from the home. You probably had a more stable household. You wouldn't have step parents, for instance. The mother would be honor bound to remain faithful. But
that's the other, like, there are like some researchers have looked at this, like, oh, like they've tracked, like, oh, there's no father in the home for this kid, and whatever, like, he still does just as well as the twin elsewhere where there was and like, again, like, a lot of researchers, what they find is, like, it's not whether a father is present in the home, it's whether fathers in general are present in the homes in that community. And so, and these kids were raised in, in the 20th century, like a lot of these data were collected in the 20th century during a period, especially because most of these data came from middle class people, where even if they had a dad who was in the Navy or a dad who was in prison or a dad who was just gone, like they were still raised in a suburb or a residential area where like other dads were involved and like that role was fulfilled. I mean, this is a very broad statement, but it's probably better for a kid to be raised by a single mom in a neighborhood full of dads than to be raised with a dad in an environment full of single moms.
That seems that seems intuitively correct, actually.
Yeah.
So I will believe it because it suits my it suits my intuition. All right. Well, I think I've taken enough of your time. Thanks so much for coming on the channel. Once again, please look in the description for Troubled on available from all good booksellers, audio, hardback. You got a paperback as well?
The paperback will be out probably next year. I don't know how they plan these things, but I read the audiobook myself. People ask me that.
Oh, nice.
So it's my voice. It was really unpleasant. I had to spend 3 days locked in a booth, but I read it, and I think it turned out well. So thank you, Polly. This has been great.
Thanks.